Hello everybody, my name is Jim Pingle and this is our December 2016 Hangout for pfSense Gold subscribers. This month we'll be talking about the console menu and how to use it. Uh, Now about this Hangout, as always we'll have project news first and then we'll talk about accessing the console menu and how to set that up. We'll talk about keyboard and video console, serial console, and SSH. We'll talk about all the options that are available on the console menu, and then we'll go over a little bit how to use the PHP shell and the TCH shell for those who are so inclined. All right, first up is our project news. Our SG-1000 units are all shipping. All the back orders have been shipped as of a couple of weeks ago. So if you were waiting for all of the back orders to die down, you can grab one now and they'll go out pretty quick. We're still improving the hardware and drivers and everything as we go, our hardware support, and as we're also, still developing 2.4 and everything's still progressing. So if you already do have an SG-1000, you want to make sure you keep up to date on snapshots and things when you get an opportunity to update. If you are on a snapshot from the last couple of days, the USB OTG port is now bootable on those snapshots. So once you've got one of the newer snapshots loaded, so it has the new U-boot environment on there, then you can boot from a connected USB device on the OTG port, like a thumb drive on an OTG cable. We also have a little bit of news about the switch framework that's in the SG-1000. If you go to interfaces and switches on there, you'll see just the basic page used to show you some information about the switches on board. We have some plans for a project that will include a large number of switch ports. So check out our blog if you want to read a little bit about that. So that's pretty exciting. We do have our enterprise support tiers coming in January. There's going to be three choices. It's a yearly support per device, and it's a not incident based, so it's like unlimited per device type support, which we've had some better feedback about. We also had pfSense go through a code audit recently. We had an independent consulting firm that we worked it out with, and they performed an audit of the code, some manual, some automated. Overall, the results were excellent. Just one or two minor things we fixed, and most of the other things that they noticed had already been addressed by the time they got us the report. So we're staying on top of things. We'll have the full details of that audit posted soon on the blog from the Netgate and pfSense side of things. All right, look at the console menu requirements. So what do you need to connect to a console? If it's a physical keyboard or video console, then you just need to have your hardware has to have video output and has to have a keyboard attached. Pretty simple. If you want to connect to the serial console, then the device, the firewall's got to have a serial port or a console port. Now, if you've got a firewall that has like a DB9 or RJ45 style console port or serial port, that's got to be on COM1. And you need to connect to that with a null modem serial cable or adapter, so you can't just use a straight through serial cable. You got to use a null modem cable. Now, on the client side of things, like where you're going to be reaching this from, you're going to have a serial port there or a USB serial converter. I've got a link there. You can follow it from the PDF later. On the Netgate store, there's a kit that has a USB serial cable and a null modem adapter together, which is handy for connecting to things like that. Now our SG devices, like our SG-1000 and the 4860, 8860 and all that, they have a micro USB console port that acts as a USB serial converter on COM2 and internally. So those, actually it's like a serial port wired internally on the board, and the USB serial controller is on the board as well. So all you need is a micro USB cable, like an Android device cable, to plug in. And on those devices, the serial console is enabled automatically. It's already set up on the right port and everything, so it's all taken care of. All you do is plug in that USB cable and make sure your local system has drivers. Now, your serial console also has to be enabled on pfSense if you have a choice anyway. It defaults to enabled for SD devices, like I just mentioned, and also if you installed from the serial mem stick, it's forced on there as well. And others, like if you have a video console that you installed with, you just have to go into it and enable that, and I'll talk about how to do that in a moment. Now, If you want to get to SSH, that's also pretty easy. It's just across the network instead of a physical console. So you just need to enable SSH on the firewall, and then you have to allow access with firewall rules. And now for all of these, whether you're coming in over serial or over SSH, I want to mention a little bit about terminal size, because by default, like PuTTY and things, they default to like 24 rows, 80 columns, which is a good traditional default. The installer works best at that size, but if you're actually talking about working and getting anything done, you really want a bigger window. I usually max out the columns at 132, and then go anywhere from like 34 to 47, 32 to 47 rows, depending on how big my screen is and the display resolution, the font I've chosen, and whatnot. So, like a couple of the terminal windows you'll see that I'm going to use during this demo, we'll have 32 rows, 132 columns. So don't be surprised if it looks a little wide. It's just because sometimes when you run commands, you need to see a lot of output. You want your terminal to be wide so you can see more output, or without wrapping, or in some cases the programs will change the output depending on your terminal size. And so you want to make sure you've got a wide terminal so you can get all of that, or even more data out of it. All right, so go over physical console configuration. If you've got a video console, it's always going to be on. It can maybe not be your primary console, but it's always going to be enabled. The serial console may need to be enabled manually if it's not your only console. So if your system has video and serial, you probably have to go in and manually enable serial. And where you do that, it's on System and Advanced on the Admin Access tab. So just System and Advanced, and then right here on the Admin Access tab, that's the first tab that comes up. All the way down here, there's a serial communications section here at the bottom. So that first box there, serial terminal, you check it to enable. If you're on a firewall or device that doesn't have a choice, like it only has serial, that box will be hidden because you can't disable it, because if you try to disable it and it let you, you lose access to a console, and that wouldn't be good. So just if you're on a system that has both video and serial, you just check this box and enable your serial console. Now the default speed is 115,200, and there's really no reason to use any slower speed these days, unless you've got a system that has a BIOS that's outputting serial at a certain speed and you have to match it, and you really can't change the BIOS or anything like that. Maybe you might want to match it like that, but in almost every case, you're going to want to use a speed of the 115,200. So when in doubt, go for 150,200. It's a good default. Most like clients and things might default to that these days, and it's a decent speed. Now you also have your primary console choice down here. It could be serial or VGA if you've got a system that supports both. If a system only has serial, that box again might be hidden. Now the difference of the primary console is pretty significant. As the kernel boots pfSense, the kernel boot messages will go to every console, the video or serial, or any physical console. It won't go to SSH because you don't have network at that point. The difference is once the kernel passes off control to pfSense, basically, only the primary console will receive output. So like all your boot messages from pfSense saying, starting like you're configuring your WAN interface, starting OpenVPN, that kind of stuff, that's only going to go to the primary console. So if you see the boot messages and it stops after mounting root and it doesn't like give you a prompt or anything, it just says mounting root, blah, 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 and then nothing, odds are you're not looking at the primary console. So if you see that on video, you probably should be looking at the serial console. If you see it on serial, you probably need to look at video. So if a problem is encountered during boot, like maybe it loses your interfaces, you got to reassign your interfaces, like if one disappeared or something changed, or if you restored a configuration but didn't get all your settings fixed before you rebooted, that kind of thing. So if something like that happens, that is only going to go to your primary console. So you need to get to the primary console to correct that problem and then continue on. But then again, after all, if on a successful boot up at the end of the boot process, no errors assuming, every console will get a menu. So your console menu will come up whether you're on serial or video. Now SSH, there's a few different ways you can set that up. Again, here on the same page, System Advanced Admin Access tab, there's a Secure Shell section just above there. A little bit of a tongue twister there sometimes. If you want to enable it, you just check Enable. And then when after you save, it'll generate your SSH keys. Now, generating the SSH keys can take a little bit of time depending on your hardware. On most beefier boxes, you won't even ever notice it. It'll just be a few seconds. But like on the SG-1000, just because of the nature of the cryptographic generation process for the keys, it's going to take, it takes about a minute and a half last time I timed it on an SG-1000. Now, the authentication method for SSH is pretty significant. When that box is unchecked, it's going to allow password authentication, and it's unchecked by default. So password authentication is convenient, but it's not as secure. You never want to expose any SSH daemon with password auth enabled to the internet at large, because people are just going to find that and brute force it, try and hit your passwords all day long. So, strong passwords can help there, but, if they can still try, it's not good. Now, pfSense will lock somebody out if they try. I think it's 15 failed attempts in 5 minutes. It'll lock them out for an hour. So it's not a security nightmare, but it's still not good that they can hit that at all and have any chance of success. So it's really, we just do not expose SSH to the internet if you have password authentication allowed. So when you check that, it's the other type of authentication is key-based authentication. So every user has their own SSH key, and then a public and private key, and the user has their private key, it's kept private, and the public key is put onto their account in the account settings. So your key is on the client, you generate a key with SSH keygen or PuttyGen or whatever your particular account settings are. Or wherever your key generation is for your client. That all depends on your client. Then after you have your public key, you just paste it here into authorized SSH keys. Like if I go back in here, I think I've got one in the admin account. Yeah, see there, I've got some SSH keys pasted in there. And so you store those on the user, and then when the user tries to authenticate, it will allow them in if their username matches, if a key matches one that's allowed under their username. Now, SSH defaults to port 22, and you can change that to another port. There's not a significant security gain by moving it to another port. I mean, somebody port scanning is still going to find it. As part of a defense in depth strategy, like, okay, I'm using key-based auth and I moved it to another port and I've got filters and things like that, that's good. But on its own, it's just a little bit of security by obscurity, and it doesn't really offer you a significant advantage. So because you don't want to expose that anyway, and it's kind of an inconvenience to have to remember what port you put it on, we usually recommend just securing it, locking it down, and leaving it on port 22, just not exposing it to the internet. So, set up a VPN, use a VPN, and connect back on 22 over the VPN. And of course, because it's over the network, your firewall rules have to allow access. And so if you absolutely have to come in over the WAN, you're going to need a WAN rule to allow you in over SSH. Now, ideally, you'd lock that down by source address, or by some means, secure it that way. Or like on a VPN, if you have your rules on your VPN, like Open VPN tab, whatever, will have to allow that through. All right, so now that we've set all our consoles up, talk about how do you get to them. Well, with a keyboard and a monitor, if you're looking for that, super simple. Just plug in a keyboard, plug in a monitor. Or if you're on a KVM, switch to that KVM port. If you're running fancier server type hardware, you might have like an IPMI, DRAC, ILO type card where you can get to your console remotely across the network using some sort of out-of-band management of that nature. So, however you can get to your video console, that's, pretty much up to your hardware, but mostly just monitor, keyboard, you're done. Serial console is a little bit more involved because, obviously there's a little bit more complexity there. You have to, get your cable connected, and like if it's a USB serial cable, you have to make sure that your client operating system is seeing that correctly, that you've got the drivers loaded for it, and so on and so forth. And then you have to know what port you're talking to. Like on Windows, you have to check in Device Manager. Like if you go under like your PC and Device Manager, and then you look at your ports, common LPT, you'll see I've got right here, I've got two different USB to serial connectors on here. Actually, I've got one's an 8860 and one is an SG1000. So I've got, one is on COM4, one is on COM5, and your COM ports numbers are going to change depending on your hardware. If you have a physical port like a DB9 type port, it's probably going to be COM1, maybe COM2. It might be COM3, COM4, COM5 if you're on USB, or it could be some wacky number up higher. That it all depends on the drivers and how you have things set. And some of these too, I think you can change this one. Like you can pick what COM number it is. So if you really wanted to put it up on a different COM number, you can manually set it up onto a higher COM number if you want. Now in your port settings in there, you don't really have to worry about the speed or anything else matching because the client will set that and we can worry about it there. All right, so now you know on Windows that's where it is. On Linux, you just have to check your log or your dmessage output. Most likely on Linux is going to be /dev/tty and then uppercase U, uppercase S, uppercase B, and then a number. So like TTY USB 0 or TTY USB 1, depending on how many USB serial adapters you've got plugged in, or it could be TTY and then some other number. Really, it's all going to be up to your operating system there. Just check what you got plugged in. On FreeBSD, it's if you have a USB serial adapter, it's going to be /dev/CUA uppercase U and then a number. If it's a physical serial port, it'll be a CUA lowercase u and then a number. A Mac again is going to vary depending on the serial cable type and OEM. Like if you're plugging in an SG device on a Mac, it's going to show up as /dev/cu dot and then uppercase SLAB, like short for Silicon Labs, and then underscore, then uppercase USB, lowercase 2, uppercase UART, just like I showed here. Kind of convoluted, so tab completion is your friend there, but that's going to be where the port is on Mac, for example. So when you're setting up your client, whatever client you use, and I'll talk about the clients in a second, all of them are going to be set to very similar settings. Your speed is going to have to match what you set for the GUI, which is, like I said, the default's 115,200, 115,200. So that's a pretty good safe bet to default your speed to. Your serial port settings, most of these are going to be default, so you may not have to touch them at all. But if you do, you set it to 8 data bits, no parity, 1 stop bit, and for flow control, you either use X on X off or disable it. Do not use RTS CTS flow control. If you have an option for that in your client, make sure it's disabled because that will not work quite right. And I've got a link there to the SG series manual reference for that has a bit more detail and walkthrough of connecting on various operating systems that's specific to the SG devices. So if you need a little bit more help getting connected to the serial console, you can continue on that page. So for what clients to use here, on Windows, pretty much anybody's going to use PuTTY or maybe Secure CRT. I like both of them. I like Secure CRT better, but it's a pretty spendy client. I've only got it on one of my computers because it's so expensive, but I use PuTTY on several others, especially VMs and things where it's free. So really all you have to do in PuTTY is open up PuTTY here. Let me find it in my list. I've already got COM4 and COM5 up, but let me kill this COM5 connection and I'll show you how it goes from the start. So when I run PuTTY, see, you select serial here. You enter in the COM port, punch in the speed if it's not already there, and then that's it. Just hit open, and off you go. See, I had a session saved in there that had all that on there, but so I got away without having to type it all out. But really, just select serial for the connection type, enter the COM port number, and then in the serial line box, and then punch in the speed, hit open. That's it. Whatever you do on Windows, do not use hyperterminal. It seems like no matter what, anytime somebody tries to use hyperterminal, we get reports of like lost characters or things being missed or things being misdrawn, and just nothing worth worrying about there. It's not worth the headache. All right, if you're on Linux, easiest thing to use is screen. or there's PuTTY as well, or Minicom or DTerm, whatever you like. Screen is easiest because it's just one little command invocation I've got right there, sudo screen, your COM port name, 115200, and the speed there. So, and that's it. You hit enter, punch in your password, and you'll be connected to your terminal. The FreeBSD, same. You can use screen. There's CU or tip. CU and tip. CU, I think you can just type in similar to the screen command. Tip, you have to set up etc. remotes with the right serial port parameters. They can be kind of interesting. Screen is obviously the easiest. CU and tip are in the base OS. If you can get along with those, you wouldn't have to install anything extra on FreeBSD. But screen is so useful, I find it hard to believe you wouldn't want it on a box. So I just use it there. For a Mac, again, you can use terminal. In the terminal, you can use screen, you can use zterm, you can use CU. And you got sudo screen, and then your command port name and or COM port name, and then 115200 for your speed. Now on a Mac, you may need to pass -uppercase U to screen so that you'll see, so it will handle UTF-8 depending on what you're doing. I believe the origin of that was at some point during the install, it wouldn't show the characters properly unless you use -U. But you may not always want to run with it. May not be any reason not to run with it, but it's just something to keep in mind. All right, so how do you get to SSH? Well, it's pretty much similar, especially if you're using PuTTY, because on Windows you can use PuTTY, you can use Secure CRT. You have more choices of clients because there's more SSH clients out there. There's Mremote NG. If you've got Cygwin, you can use the CLI command line SSH. If you've got Windows 10 Anniversary Edition and the Ubuntu integration installed, you can pull up a bash prompt and use CLI SSH there. If you're on Linux or FreeBSD, you can use, I think, PuTTY. I know PuTTY's on there for Linux. I think it's still on there for FreeBSD. I have to check. Command line SSH, obviously, in any terminal. Or there's also PAC, which I've used on Linux before, which is Perl Auto Connector. It's a session manager that's a little bit different oriented than PuTTY is. On a Mac, you've got your terminal or iTerm2. There's other SSH clients out there. Now, no matter what operating system you're using, it has to be a recent version of a client because as of, I think it was 2.3.1 or 2.3.2, we increased the security of SSH. We restricted the number of the types of numbers of key exchange, cipher, and MAC algorithms that were allowed to only ones that were considered very secure. And so like older versions of PuTTY cannot connect. Older versions of Secure CRT cannot connect, but if you update to the most recent versions, they'll connect fine. So if you see an error or something about key exchange not working, then that's you just need to update your client. And if you're on a command line, connecting with SSH is the same on any operating system. You just type SSH space username @ and then the IP address or host name of the firewall. Now, if you've moved it to another port, you may have to pass it, -p space and then your port number. But if you kept it on 22, you just SSH username @ host, press enter, then enter your firewall or key passphrase, whatever you get prompted for. If you're using a GUI client like PuTTY, you just have to set it to connect to the firewall IP address on the correct port with the expected username. So again, like with PuTTY, if we just go into PuTTY here, it defaults to SSH. So you just punch in the host name of whatever you want to connect to. Let me see, what's a good one? Assuming I can resolve this from here. And you can just do that. You can save a session if you want, or just open. Accept the key if it's never connected to it before. Accepting the key is fine. You really probably want to read that screen over a little bit more carefully than I did. I know these machines, so I know they're all right. Log in as your root or admin, and then your admin password and connected. Super easy. Now, if you're doing key-based authentication, you're going to have to look at your client documentation to figure out exactly how that works. You might have to, obviously have to generate a key and get the public key into pfSense, and then you'll also have to, you might have to run like an SSH agent or similar to where you will, where it will keep your keys available, as long as you're logged in, that sort of thing. And again, just to repeat, if your client doesn't work, update it because it may be out of date and not up to security standards. So what are all these console menu tasks we're talking about here? Well, it's just basically all these things here on the menu. I'm going to go over each of these at least briefly, and including some you may or may not see on all of them. Like you'll see some options are on certain setups and then are not on others. So first up is logout. That's on SSH only. It is the only place that has any effect. Just ends your current SSH session. Also, you just press enter without entering an option. That will also kick you out, as will Control D at the prompt will also log you out. Option 1 here to assign interfaces. That will prompt you to wipe the existing interface configuration and start over with new assignments. So it's the same procedure that gets triggered if you like post install, if it doesn't recognize your interfaces or if your interfaces change unexpectedly. It's the same procedure you might have seen before there, where it'll let you create VLANs, and then after you create VLANs, it'll let you assign interfaces. At the moment, it doesn't support other types like lag or PPPoE or things like that. So it's really just VLANs and straight, physical interfaces. Once you've got your VLANs created, it will print you out a list of interfaces that you've got and the MAC addresses, and it prompts you, okay, what do you want to use for WAN? Then you punch in the interface, you press enter. What do you want to use for LAN? Punch in the interface, press enter, and then so on and so forth. When you run out of interfaces or when you're done, you just press enter, and it will go on and it'll prompt you for confirmation. You do have to have at least one interface assigned. That's the WAN. After that, you could skip if you really wanted to, but just repeating that for good measure. Next big task is to set an interface IP address. And that'll work for an IP address on any firewall interface. A long time ago, that only worked for this option only worked on the LAN IP address, but now it works for any. So it will ask if you want to do DHCP configuration for the interface, like to act as a DHCP client. And if you do, that's fine. Is there like a WAN, this DHCP, that's good. Otherwise, it'll ask if you tell it it's static, like you say no to DHCP, it'll prompt you for the IP address, the subnet mask. You can punch in a gateway if you want. If it's a WAN, you'd want to put a gateway in. If it's not, if it's a LAN, leave that out. It'll prompt you whether or not you want to act as a DHCP server on that interface. And then if you say yes, it'll also ask you for the DHCP address range to use for that interface. So it's kind of a convenient way to set up a new interface because it's a little quicker than the GUI in some ways if it's a new interface, because you don't have to set up the interface and then go to the separate DHCP settings page and do all that. Unless you have advanced things you want to set, then you'd need to go and do all that in the GUI. But this is a pretty quick way to set up the basics of a new interface if all you need is the IP address and DHCP and to set up the server. So pretty quick. So also another thing this does is as a relic of what it used to be. If the firewall GUI is configured for HTTPS, it will prompt you to switch it back to HTTP just to get you back in if SSL isn't functioning. Which is you could do that, or I'll talk about it in a little bit. But if it's just your certificate that's messed up, there's another script I'll show you later that will generate you a new certificate, which might be a better choice than doing it this way. But if it's on HTTPS, you need to get it back to just HTTP. You can use this to get it back. There's like you punch in set interface address, tell it LAN, enter the exact same options you've already got in there now, and then just say yes to that prompt, and it'll reset you. Running through this script also resets the anti-lockout rule in case you've been locked out of the GUI. And so if you really didn't want that enabled, you'd have to go back after you regain access and make sure that it make sure it's set the way you want it to be set. All right, our next task is to reset your password. If you reset the web configurator password for option 3, it just resets the admin password back to pfSense, which is the default. A couple other things it does, if your GUI authentication source is set to a remote authentication server like Radius or LDAP, it prompts you to reset that back to the local database. So say you were connected to a Radius or LDAP server that's remote and you've been disconnected from it for some reason, whether it's down or you're tearing it down, whatever. If it's hindering your access to get into the GUI to do anything, you could use this option to to sever that tie so you could get back in, and then you could reset it back later, or remove the settings entirely later. But this just, it will set your GUI authentication source back to locally if you want it to. If the admin account had been removed, it will also recreate the account, which you can't delete it now, you can only disable it, but previous versions would let you rename the admin account to something else, and that could have had a detrimental effect in it. That script would recreate the admin account and make sure it had the right settings if you needed it to. And if the admin account is disabled, that script will re-enable it. So up next is factory defaults. When you press this option, it's the same as doing it from the GUI under diagnostics and factory defaults. It will restore the system configuration back to the factory default. So what that does is it looks in /conf.default/config.xml, the file that's there, which is the default configuration for your platform. And that would have been determined during the installation process. And it will just copy that over your existing configuration, blow away the config cache, and then restart. It also does attempt to remove non-default packages. So if you had other things installed, it tries to remove them, but it may not be 100%, especially if a package wasn't functioning or something else was broken. What it does not do is make any file system changes. So it really doesn't, it won't go through and like reset any files. If you think something is corrupted or damaged, or maybe a manual edit went wrong or whatever, it's not gonna help you at all for that. So if you need to make sure that everything is reset back to complete stock, a wipe and reload is a better choice. And that's especially true if you're thinking of like handing off the firewall to somebody else at a different location or selling it, whatever. Don't rely on factory defaults, because it can leave some personal information behind on there. You want to wipe and reload, or even swap in a fresh disk if you're actually selling it. You may not want to give away the disk it was on, just to be on the safe side, especially if you had anything important on there like VPN keys or whatnot. Next is the reboot system, which it just does a clean shutdown of the firewall and then restarts it. On 2.3 and before, it's a pretty boring menu, just has a yes or no. On 2.4, we've added several new options on here. The first is just to do a normal reboot, which is the traditional, just clean shutdown and restart. The second is a new cool option called reroute. It doesn't do a full reboot. What it does is it restarts everything without reloading the kernel. So it shuts down almost completely, except but it stays in the kernel. Then it kills all the processes, remounts all the file systems, and reruns the startup sequence. So it's very fast because it doesn't have to go through all of like the hardware probing, device probing, doesn't have to reload all the kernel modules and things like that. It just, and it also doesn't have to reset the hardware at all either. So it's just very quick, kills everything and restarts everything. So that is a very good option if you didn't change anything that would require like a change in the kernel or whatever, or like a loader tunable, anything like that. Like say you just, maybe you used one of the other commands we'll talk about to restore an old configuration, but it doesn't do a full reboot, it just does a reroute instead. So that's a really nice option. Another option we have on there now is to reboot in a single user mode, because you can do that from the boot menu at option 2, but for some people it's hard to catch that. And so if us acting as support representatives talking to a customer, we need to walk somebody through something in single user mode, that we can use that to get them in a single user mode without having to play keyboard acrobatics. Now that does need console access to get back out of. We're talking like a physical console, because single user mode doesn't have network access or any of the file systems mounted, read-write or anything like that. It's a very low level access mode where you can get to a lot of things sometimes you can't do when the system is up and running. So it's sort of like a fail-safe recovery type mode. So most people would not have any reason to ever get in there, but it makes it convenient for us as support representatives to have that option there. There's also the reboot and run a file system check. What that does is it reboots, and when it boots back up, it runs the file system check 5 times over, because running it just once or twice doesn't always catch everything, sometimes even 3 times, just because of the way the file system works, at least with UFS. So, that'll reboot and run a file system check if it's needed, which can help in some cases if there's a problem with the file system isn't writing properly, or in some cases, like if there's some corruption, like maybe it runs for a while, then every once in a while it might crash and reboot, claiming there's a problem in a directory or some sort, then, forcing a file system check in that way will be more reliable. Okay, halting a system. For option 6, that cleanly shuts down the firewall, stops all processes, synchronizes all the file systems, and then it attempts to power off the firewall if the hardware is capable. Some can, some can't. So it at least halts the operating system. Um, and usually it'll power off, but not all hardware is capable of powering off. So if it doesn't, it will just sit there indefinitely. Then you just have to yank power after it gets to the point where it halts. So you always want to use this option or the GUI equivalent when you're turning off the firewall. You never want to abruptly disconnect power. It's very disruptive, and it can in some rare cases cause file system corruption. All right, console menu option 7 is to ping a host. Just a simple network diagnostic test. It sends 3 ICMP echo requests to a target and displays the results. It'll prompt you for an address, and if you enter an IPv4 address or a host name, it'll use just a plain ping. If you give it an IPv6 address, it'll use ping 6. The only thing it can't do is do an IPv6 ping to a host name, but if you need to do that, you can just drop to a shell prompt and just use ping 6 with the host name. Option 8 is the shell. It starts a TCSH shell and presents a shell prompt, and I'll cover that more toward the end. Option 9 is pftop. It invokes pftop for a real-time view of the firewall state table activity. There's a lot of views in pftop. Let me find a good one here to show you. Get out of there. Option 9. So there's a lot of different views. If you press any number from 0 through 8, it will switch to a different view. And most of the views center on different types of things, like this is viewed on rules, this one's on time, some on speed, rule labels, things like that. And if you press question mark on your keyboard, it'll show you a list of things you can do, and even ways you can sort the list. So while this isn't really great for finding like one person making a bunch of connections out, like a torrenter type thing, if it's like one state using a bunch of bandwidth, you might be able to like use the speed view sorted by rate, so you can see, who's using speed or who's using bandwidth at that time. So pretty interesting little program there. We've got some more documentation on that in the book and the different views, if you want to check that out in more detail. Or again, most things you can figure out just by punching the keys or hitting question mark and look at the help and see what's there. That's pretty handy though. The filter logs for option 10, what it does is it runs like a tail on the filter log file. What it really does, it uses clog because we use binary circular logs, and it dumps the whole log file and then it follows it. But it uses the raw log format when you use option 10, and that's documented on the wiki, which I've got a link to here. If you want a simpler real-time view, you can drop to a shell prompt and use a filter parser to look at a parsed view, which will give you a simplified version. It just prints like the time and the interface and the action and the source and destination addresses and ports and things in the protocol, similar to what you see in the basic view of the GUI, but so it can be handy to watch it in real time at the shell using that particular type of invocation there. Option 11 to restart the web configurator. What it does is restarts Nginx, which is the web server that runs our web GUI. And usually you wouldn't want to do that too often unless you for some reason you couldn't get to the GUI and you were trying to restart it just to make sure that wasn't it. Usually you want to use that in conjunction with option 16 to restart PHP FPM, which is the daemon that manages the PHP for access by Nginx. All right, so option 12 is a PHP Shell and pfSense tools. That starts the interactive PHP Shell, and I'll talk about that more just after I get through these options. And that it runs a PHP Shell in a context of similar to the firewall GUI, to where you can interact with the firewall configuration. There's also option 13 is to update from the console. That just runs an OS update, tries to get you up to the latest version of pfSense, the same as it does from the GUI. Option 14, enable and disable secure shell. I already mentioned that before. It just toggles it. If it's on, it'll turn it off. If it's off, it'll turn it on. Now, option 15 to restore a recent configuration. It's very similar to the configuration history in the GUI. So if I do just like option 15 here, actually let me make this terminal a little bigger before I do that. A little taller, because this. If I do option 15, I can list backups, and it will show me here. It lists the time the backup was made, the configuration revision, the username that made the backup, and their IP, the user's IP address that they were coming from at the time, and the reason the backup was made, if it's known. So all of these are backups you can restore, and they're all numbered, and usually it keeps about 30 of them. On Nano BSD on 2.3 and before, it only keeps like 5 unless you told it to keep more, but it'll keep 30 of them there for most people. Or there's also a number you can set. So when it goes from there, you can tell it to restore a configuration if you want, and then you can just punch in the number that you want to restore, and then it will restore that. Now, that doesn't apply changes. It just it just puts that configuration into place. So if you know it was a simple change, you could just go into the GUI in that area, maybe apply settings. So this is very useful for, say you made a change to the system that didn't have the intended effect. Maybe it cut off your network access. You need to get back into the firewall. You need to get back to a known good configuration. So using this, you can step back, and then you might afterwards you probably want to reboot, but you might even, if you're on 2.4, you can do a reroute, which would just, it wouldn't reboot all the way. It would just reload pfSense basically and reload all your settings, which would be a quicker way about it. That next option to restart PHP FPM, that will basically kill all the PHP processes running for the GUI, and then restart the fast CGI manager that dispatches PHP processes for the GUI. Most people wouldn't have to hit this, but sometimes the GUI might be stuck doing something and you can't get out of it, or it might give you like a 500 error, like a 502 error, bad gateway, that kind of thing. If you see that, get to the console, run option 16, then maybe option 11 after that, and get back to the GUI in a working state. All right, so there's a couple more options that are context specific, or at least one here. If you're on an SG-1000 unit, booted from one of the SD card images, you can use option 99 to install the eMMC. Now, this may not be something you'll see very much of in active use because most people are going to be running it from the eMMC, or they will be running it from, or they may be doing an SD card that just has a recovery image that doesn't need this. So when that's invoked, it copies the running system over to eMMC, and then you can power it off, remove the SD card, and then it'll reboot off the eMMC when you close it back up. There is also a hidden option 100 that nobody knows about, that we haven't documented anywhere, that you heard it here first, unless you've looked at the source code, that launches links, command line text-based web browser, and it attempts to connect to the firewall GUI. Let me break out of this. I'll show you what that does. Now, it doesn't have JavaScript support, so its usefulness is very limited. So you basically just tell it, okay, yes, invalid certificates, okay, admin, pfSense, because I'm just using the default login here. Now, another thing about links is it does not handle a redirect, so that doesn't do much. But afterwards, if you just arrow down to one of these other links and hit G and go, got to enter the URL /index.php. There you see you got your menu, paging down. So you've got some of the dashboard info. Now, the formatting, of course, is going to be a little weird because you're in a text browser. It doesn't support JavaScript, so you don't expect things like Ajax to work. But you can still get to some info here. So you can still perform some actions, like you can see you could manipulate firewall rules or a few things like that. So it can be useful. We've had maybe a handful of cases in the past where it's been useful, but it's nice to have, even if you need to test access to something else, outside, links is there if you want to run it from a shell. All right, so let's talk a little bit about using the PHP shell. So of course, before I say this, I have to say, warning, we don't support this. You could break something, don't do this. So when you go into the PHP shell, it's just option 12. And it starts up, shows you can type help to get a lot of very detailed help. If you run help, it shows you a whole bunch of examples. Some of the examples are a little dated, but they can be helpful to kind of figure out what you're doing in the general form and general syntax. So you can interact with the configuration if you want. It's primarily used for developers or people that are trying to use scripting or importing things, or very advanced users. So you can read the configuration from the config variable or globals from the G variable. You can write the configuration if you need to, like you see there's a write config, or if you pass it a string in the middle or in the parameters that'll use a message that records what it's saved. Now, trying to apply changes is a little trickier. You'd have to dig up whatever page you're trying to emulate and look at what it does on apply and sort of do the same kind of thing. The PHP shell supports session recording and playback is probably the most commonly used thing. We ship with a number of default playback scripts. Like if I exit out of here and go back in, you can see all of the playback commands are listed here, and these are going to be what most people are going to use. So just for an example, I could do playback gateway status, this is a new script for 2.4, so you wouldn't have it on an older box, and it prints the gateway status there. Now I can also do these playback scripts from the shell, but I'll go over all of the scripts here in a moment. First, I want to, I type help, showed that. So to get out of it, you type exit or Control C to get out. So you enter in a block of commands. It could be one line, it could be multiple lines, and after your block of code, you type exec, E-X-E-C on one line. That's it, no semicolon after it, whatever, and that is a trigger that tells the shell to execute that block of code. So like this command example here, I'm going to var dump config, if I can type right. I'll dump the LAN interface configuration for DHCP. See, it doesn't do anything when I press enter, but you type exec, and now it runs that command and dumps out. You can see all of the values that it printed out. So if you're familiar with PHP and you're familiar with pfSense, it's fairly intuitive. So the playback scripts, I just showed you one from here. I'm going to back out of this and go to a shell prompt. I'll show you how to run it from the shell. So if you do playback like gateway status, from here you just type pfSSH.php space playback space and then the script name, and then any options you want after that. Some playback scripts have options, others don't. Most of the ones that need options will yell at you if you in a nice way that you didn't put them if you need to, or if you needed to. All right, so let's go over what all these different playback scripts do. The change password script, like it says, changes the password for a user. You can give the username as an optional argument. If you don't give it, it'll prompt you for one. Then it'll ask you to enter a password and confirm the password. It will also reset or prompt you to reset if the account's disabled or expired. that is useful because at the command line, if you want to change somebody's password on a traditional Unix system, you use like the PASSWD command, which changes it in the password database locally on there, but that won't stick on pfSense. You need to put the password in the configuration of pfSense. So that's why the script is useful, because it will change the password for the user in the context of pfSense, so the firewall as a whole, and not just at the OS layer, which can get overwritten the next time pfSense synchronizes users. Next, we have enable carp and disable carp. Just the same as the button in the GUI, it will disable carp or enable it. It doesn't persist across reboots. You got enable carp mate and disable carp mate, which is carp maintenance mode, which is a persistent demotion of a unit, so it will persist across reboots. That's useful for using during upgrades and things. More info on that you can find in the hangout on carp. We've got disable DHCPD, which removes all DHCP server configuration from all interfaces on the firewall and stops the DHCP server, which could be useful in a situation where, say you're in a panic. There's a you've got your LAN connected to some other interface that's already got a DHCP server and you're wreaking havoc on the network. You want to wipe it out. Well, that's a good way to wipe it out. Disable referrer check is a script that will help you get into the GUI if you're being blocked by the referrer checking feature, a security measure. So if you can't hit the GUI, you're getting a referrer verification error, and what you're doing should work. Well, you can run that script. It'll disable the referrer check, let you get in, and then you can make any adjustments you need to make to let you in without getting the error. And then move on by. Enable allow all WAN. It's very useful for lab setups. Like virtual machines that either they have nothing connected on their LAN right then, or even firewall devices that you've got just dangling off their WANs for a test lab setup, whatever. I use this all the time. We use it. A lot of us do. Have particular lab setups or testing setups where this makes sense. But basically, you just enable allow all WAN, drops an allow all rule on the WAN, so it's very temporary. You never ever want to use that in production. But it lets you get into the GUI real quick, so you can add your own access rules and then delete the allow all rule once you're in. But it's just a way to get you into the GUI very temporarily, or allow you into whatever you need to get into very temporarily until you can adjust your rules to fix it. So yeah, don't do that while you're connected to the internet, folks, but it's useful for labs. Enable SSHD. Same as the other enabling options I told you about before. It turns it on, generates your keys, whatnot. External config locator does the same thing that I think it happens at boot up also, where it tries to pull a config off of a removable disk like a thumb drive. Gateway status. It prints a gateway status formatted for the terminal, which I just showed you over there. That's a new script for 2.4. Generate GUI cert. I alluded to this one earlier. It generates and activates a new certificate for the GUI, and it uses like the current firewall host name as part of the common name, and it also generates a unique identifier. It's really useful, especially if you have a firewall that's had the same certificate for a long time. Like say you've been upgrading it since like the 1.2 days or even 2.0, because those certificates made back then had very generic properties. They were uniquely generated, so they didn't have the same keys or anything, but they all had the same like subject for the certificate. And if you load too many of those in Firefox just barfs. It will lock up. It won't let you get in. So if you replace those certificates with current certificates that are unique, then you don't have to worry about it. You can still get through. They'll work just fine in Firefox, and also the new certificates are generated with more secure defaults as well. So less to worry about. So if you suspect that your certificate's getting a little stale, or if you can get into your firewall in other browsers except Firefox but not Firefox, hop on there, generate yourself a new GUI cert, and it'll probably start working again. Now, gitsync is a developer script, probably not something your average user will ever use or should ever use. It copies down recent commits from GitHub to the firewall to catch up on changes, mostly used for tracking little changes between snapshots. It doesn't update binaries, so if you sync to some code that needs a new binary, you didn't get the new binary, you're in a little bit of a pickle. So you really take care if you ever want to touch that. But honestly, stay away. Just leave that for us developers. Let's see, install package, list package, and uninstall package. They manipulate packages similar to the package management in the GUI, but they're not as useful on 2.3. We needed those on 2.2 and before because of the way the package system worked. It wasn't very efficient. And it worked differently in the shell than it did in the GUI. But now on 2.3 and later, using the package commands directly in the shell works the same as manipulating packages in the GUI. The difference is, the package names you have to pass it. And that's very minor. So those scripts are probably going to go away pretty soon. They may not even end up staying in 2.4, but probably won't need those. PF anchor drill is a new one for 2.4 also. What it does is it recursively searches through PF anchors and prints an NAT or firewall rules it finds. It's useful for debugging services that rely on anchors like UPnP or RelayD. So if you had UPnP active and you ran that script, it would show you the NAT, like the NAT redirect and the firewall rule that were dynamically added by UPnP, so you can see what it's actually going to pass through. There's also PF table drill, which is also new for 2.4, that prints all the contents of all PF tables. You can look at them individually under diagnostics and tables, but this is the only way to dump them all in one go. Even dumping all the information from PF, like with pfCTL, like show everything, it doesn't dump you all the table contents. But this is handy, like if you're trying to find if an address or subnet's mentioned anywhere in any of your aliases, whether they're whether they've been resolved from host names or they were in URL tables and whatnot, it'll dump it all. Remove package config. What it does is it removes all your settings from packages, and including the records of installed packages. It also cuts out like menu entries, tabs, services, things like that from packages. So you don't want to run that unless you've already manually removed all of your packages, because that would leave you in a very inconsistent state. So really, that's the most use you might get out of that might be like uninstalling all of your packages, running that to wipe out the package configuration, and then reinstalling packages and redoing your settings. But very few people use this. Most people these days prefer to just download a config backup, edit out specifically what they don't want, and then just restore that. Let's see, remove shaper. The remove shaper script will remove all of the alt Q queues and rules generated by the shaper wizard. So say you ran through the shaper wizard and something went wrong, and boom, you cut off your network access. So you can't get to the GUI, nobody can get out, everybody's in a panic. You could just pop onto the console and run that remove shaper command, and it'll wipe it all out. And then you can get back in the GUI and try the shaper again. Let's see. Next script is reset web GUI. That resets the GUI theme, your dashboard widgets, and menu configuration all back to default. So if for some reason, like your dashboard's messed up, it's not showing you the widgets you have configured, or you're having trouble rearranging them into various, I don't know. We've had a couple of interesting issues with the dashboard over time. I think all of them have been corrected, but if for some reason you fall into a configuration where your dashboard isn't behaving properly, you can use that script to reset your dashboard back to the defaults and start over. And that's just like your widget arrangements and which ones you had open, which ones you didn't. The GUI theme, and I think the menu configuration, like whether or not it follows you up and down the screen and whatnot. Restart DHCPD will stop and start the DHCP daemon, which you can also do with the service control I'll go over in a minute. Restart IPsec reloads the strong swan config for IPsec and goes in and out of there. The service script is a little bit more complicated, but it's really cool. It lets you control services similar to status services in the GUI. And some of them have specific options that you could use, like OpenVPN lets you restart servers and clients, and based on their ID number. Captive Portal, you can restart things for just certain things by zone name. So like if you look at the examples I've got there, you do like pfSSH.php, playback service stop BSNMPD would stop BSNMPD. You could restart it again. And the service names are the names that you see under status and services. And those will, if they have multiple words, like they've got two words separated by a space, you want to put that in quotes. All right, so getting back out of the PHP shell and just into the regular TCSH shell, I'll have to be pretty brief on this because we're kind of a little bit over on time. But again, obligatory danger, you don't do this, you're unsupported, you could break stuff. Um, but uh, it's when you log into pfSense and just hit a shell, it's very similar to just a traditional Unix shell. There's a lot of common utilities, Unix utilities that are present, things that we use in scripting and things like that for running the firewall, or gathering information and showing you things or taking actions. So it's just the shell you get is TCSH. And if you're familiar with FreeBSD, you'd probably be pretty at home, especially, even just general Unix, if you have any Unix shell knowledge. Um, there are quite a number of utilities that may not be there because of size or security constraints, like there's no compiler environment, there's no include files or headers or things like that, or there's no man or info pages. Um, and if you try to make any permanent changes to a configuration that's used by a daemon, it's going to get rewritten or overwritten rather by pfSense the next time that area synchronizes. So you don't want to try to make any changes to like daemon configuration files or anything like that. But if you're interested in poking around in there, just look for there's books on Unix shells all over the place. O'Reilly's got a bunch of them that are really nice, like Unix in a nutshell and things like that. But just look over FreeBSD or general Unix shell thing. But if you're really not familiar with it, cut your teeth on a regular box. Don't go poke around the firewall and try and get familiar with the shell that way. If you prefer to use Bash instead of TCSH, you can add Bash with package add if you want. Now Bash would not be invoked automatically. Like after you hit 8 for the shell, you'd have to type Bash to get into Bash. But yeah, just don't be tempted to use the firewall as a general purpose Unix shell server. It's not intended for that. So only firewall administrators should have access to SSH. Don't just let any old person have access to SSH just because they want a Unix shell. Use a dedicated server for that kind of thing. We do have a sudo package in our GUI packages to grant non-root users access to run programs as root. So say all of your administrators have their own individual accounts and you want them to be able to run things in the context of root, things that they wouldn't have permission to run otherwise, or see things they wouldn't have permission to otherwise. Use the sudo package to set that up. You can also copy files to and from the firewall with SCP using the root user. That PDF's wrong. I'll get that corrected. Admin will not work. It has to be the root user or another user that has permission. And as far as clients for that go, the command line SCP or FileZilla, those are the best bets. WinSCP is all right. There's some other SCP clients out there that are probably okay. It's just a matter of finding one that works best for you. But FileZilla works really nicely for a GUI client. All right, so that's about all I got time to go over today. I don't know if anybody has any questions. Go ahead and type them out in the chat. Somebody had sent me a private message, asked me if my WAN was the 198 address. Actually, that is not. It's the WAN of these VMs, but it is one of the lesser used documentation networks. There's the 198.51.100/24 and 203.0.113/24 are documentation networks, just like 192.0.2. And on the IPv6 side, the 2001 DB8 is all documentation networks. So they're all private networks, but they're used for documentation. And all my labs are set up for documentation for things like the hangout and writing the book and the doc wiki and things like that. I like to have examples that use the proper documentation subnets, and people aren't familiar with them, so they look like public addresses. So it works out pretty nicely. All right, so anybody have any questions or anything they want me to go over? It's probably ready to start celebrating the new year. Somebody's asking about FQ code. No, I'm not talking about traffic shaping today. We're just talking the console menu. Something else that came up today that I figured I'd mention while I'm waiting for anybody to type. If you're an SG1000 user, the temperature gauge that we were using, the chip on the board is not very accurate, so we disable the temperature gauge on the dashboard. So if you update to a new snapshot, don't be surprised if your temperature gauge goes away because it was horribly inaccurate. I think the temperature range said it could be plus or minus 10.8 degrees. So we just decided if it was going to be that inaccurate, and it had been in practice, we were just going to remove it. Let's see. Okay, here's a question. Are you planning to create a real CLI shell like the CLI.sh? Well, I wouldn't technically call that a real CLI shell, but if you're talking like a configuration engine type thing, then it's yes, we are looking into that. Probably not going to happen in the pfSense 2.x, but maybe 3. How are the 2.4 snaps coming along? Are they getting ready? Are they getting close to production at home? I'm running it at home. There are still a couple of nits that might keep me from telling others to run it at home. So yeah. Oh, I'm sorry. So like there's a couple of things like reply to isn't working, so multi-WAN might not work very well for people. And that includes like your regular WAN plus an open VPN WAN. If your open VPN WAN becomes your default gateway, that may not work very well for incoming connections. That might be the only big sticking point left, I think. But there's a lot of things that are running very nicely. And I'm running it at home. We've got a couple of our developers running it at home. I think not all of our support staff have switched over yet, but we're very close. Very close. And speaking of 2.4 snaps, we just put OpenVPN 2.4 that just dropped this week in the snapshots. That's in the most recent snapshot. And that's going to be cool because it'll get us AES GCM support for OpenVPN, which hopefully should bring us a good speed boost. Anything else? Anybody else? Okay, well, I'm going to go ahead and call it there. Let everybody out, or everybody should go celebrate the new year. We'll see everybody back next month. We don't have a topic set yet, but if you have any ideas, let us know. And we will see you all there.